Hello, everyone, and welcome to a new episode of the World War II Daily Podcast with your hosts, Samuel De Corti and me, Pietro Deserti. First, I'd like to thank Dr. Greenwald for taking the time to join us on our show. It is a pleasure to have you here and to learn directly from your expertise. I'm sure our audience will find this discussion both insightful and fascinating. Well, today we have the opportunity to explore one of the most important, yet often overlooked aspects of wartime technology: anti aircraft artillery. While much attention is given to dogfights and bombing raids, the weapons on the ground played a crucial role in defending key assets for the Allied forces. To help us better understand this topic, we are joined by Dr. Bryon Greenwald, who I will introduce in just a moment. Before I do it, don't forget that this show is available on YouTube, Spotify, Deezer, Amazon, and Apple Podcasts. Be sure to like, subscribe, and engage with us. It really helps the project. For daily World War II content and updates about the show, follow us on Instagram at World War II underscore daily and at Samuel.decorti. Links will be available on the description of the episode. Now, let me introduce you our guest. He joined the Joint Forces Staff College after an Army career during which he held a variety of command and staff assignments, including Patriot Air Defense Battalion Command, Garrison Command of Fort Bliss, Texas, and Chief of Staff J8 USF Com. Dr. Greenwald graduated from the U.S. Military Academy, the U.S. Army Command, and General Staff College and School of Advanced Military Studies, and the National War College. He holds MA and Ph.D. degrees in history from the Ohio State University. Dr. Greenwald's interests are in military theory, 20th and 21st century military history, leading innovation and change in civil military relations. He has published extensively in professional journals and is the author of Scud Alert: The History, Development, and Military Significance of Ballistic Missiles on Tactical Operations, and The Anatomy of Change: Why Armies Succeed or Fail at Transformation. He's currently writing the history of the U.S. Army anti-aircraft artillery development from 1917 to 1945. In 2003, he received the National War College Excellence in Writing Award for his study, Understanding Change, an intellectual and practical study of military innovation. In 2005, Dr. Greenwald won the Defense Community's Military Leadership Award for his transformation of the Fort Bliss military community. In 2010 and 2019, he won the JFSC Faculty Recognition of Excellence Award. Dr. Greenwald has advised 73 JAWS master's thesis students, including 26 award winners, and mentored 32 students to present papers at international conferences. Well, Dr. Greenwald, welcome to the World War II Daily Podcast with me, Pietro Deserti, and my friend Samuel De Corti. But first of all, is there anything you would like to add or change to the introduction? Because it's from internet.
Well, thank you very much, Samuel and Pietro, for having me today. I really appreciate being here. Um, I really enjoy teaching. To me, it's an extension of leadership into the classroom. Um, uh, and Having the opportunity to pass on some knowledge, the knowledge that I've gained, both as a historian and as a military officer, to another generation or two of somewhat senior military officers. The school I teach at, the Joint Advanced Warfighting School, is actually one of the Department of Defense, U.S. Department of Defense war colleges located in Norfolk, Virginia. It's a pretty rigorous program. As we like to say, it's the Ranger School, U.S. Army Rangers, a very tough school. It's the Ranger School of Planning. And we graduate lieutenant colonels and colonels that go on to be chief of plans and hold senior positions at the combatant commands like U.S. AFRICOM, U.S. CENTCOM, U.S. UCOM, U.S. Indo-PACOM, those sorts of things. So it's a mix of history, strategic thinking, and campaign planning that we focus on, which is a really nice niche for someone like me who's done all three of those things, throughout his professional career, both in the military and now since I retired from the Army. So again, thank you for having me. I really look forward to the conversation today.
Awesome. Thank you very much. We are also very happy to have you here for many reasons. You can see your curriculum is spectacular. But anyways, I struggled to summarize it in this short text.
Oh
But
no, you did
anyways,
you
yeah.
did fantastic. You did
Oh,
fantastic. And one late breaking announcement I'll offer, and I'll try to remember to put a shameless plug in at the end. Um,
mm,
the Society for Military History, smh-hq.org, is the largest English-speaking society for military history in the world. I would encourage your listeners to join, check out the website. It's a very welcoming society. You can be, a Pulitzer Prize winner, or you can be a history teacher or a professor, or you can be an enthusiast who's really into, let's say, the study of World War II or the Civil War or Vietnam or, European wars, whatever it is, ancient war. And it's not just guns and battles. There are folks that look at civil military relations. There are people that study war and society, and its impact, on people, individuals. So it runs the gamut, left and right, up and down. But it's a huge, very welcoming society. The rates for students are dirt cheap, and it's relatively inexpensive for the rest of us. And I bring that up because I was just elected as the vice president of the society, and so I feel like I have an obligation now to increase its membership and pass on the great benefits of a very welcoming society and a community that really just gets into studying and talking about all aspects of military history. So over to you. Thank you.
you're welcome. I'm gonna put the link to the website on the description of the episode, so people who are listening to this can get to the link right
Fantastic.
now if they want to. Okay. All right. So the first question we do to all of our guests is always the same question: is how did you actually get got interested in, well, not only World War II, but war and military studies in general? How did it start?
Sure. Well, I was fortunate enough to gain acceptance to West Point out of American high school, and there, you can't help but be interested in military history because it's the history of what you're about to go do when you graduate. Each graduate has a commitment for 5 years in the U.S. military, in the Army, in this case. And at West Point, they spend a great deal of time, back then at least, on teaching military history. A lot of it is at the tactical level, but it's important to understand, where you came from as a profession. In this case, the Army. The other academies do the same thing, and I'm sure academies in your nations do the same thing as well. Where did you come from, and where are you going to as a future professional in that service? So after graduating from West Point, I joined the Army, obviously, as an active duty officer in air defense artillery, um, and served both in the United States and in Europe in the late 80s. And it was there that I realized I might have an interest in military history. I mean, how can you be in Europe and not really appreciate military history, right? And then I had the opportunity. The Army asked me if I wanted to go back to graduate school to the Ohio State University to study military history and teach it at West Point. Um, and you've probably heard this before from some of your visitors to the podcast, is that you think you know things when you read them, but you really learn things when you have to teach them. And so teaching the subject really brought it in. First off, I was very fortunate enough to be provided with an opportunity for 2 years to study under some of the best historians in the world, in Alan Millett, Williamson Murray, uh, Joe Gilmartin, Joe Cruzel, a political scientist, and others. And I met many of the folks that we now have on our bookshelves. And I went to school with a cohort of historians that have gone on to grad students that have gone on to fill another bookshelf or two with outstanding works across the spectrum of military history, like the likes of Brian Lynn, Mark Grimsley, Rob Citino, and that folks of that caliber. And I've been trying to keep up with them ever since. And so that's how I really got into the subject or to the field of military history and into the subject of anti-aircraft artillery or air defense. It was my job in the Army. As you noted, I commanded a Patriot battalion. I was a Shored, Chaparral Vulcan Stinger battery commander in Germany in the middle 80s. I fought part of the Cold War from all over Germany. So I really had an abiding interest in the present of that branch, but I didn't know anything about the past. And when I went to graduate school, we had to write a thesis, and then I ultimately did my dissertation. And I realized that the U.S. Army history of anti-aircraft did not exist. There was one study published by the Army, Army Ground Forces Study number 26. It's relatively brief. It's very helpful in my research, but it's relatively brief and it doesn't provide the whole picture from World War II, nor does it go back to World War I. There's one work on that by a fellow named Charlie Kirkpatrick, who passed away, called Archie in the AEF, which is a great starting point. In fact, Charlie Kirkpatrick recruited me to go to West Point and teach history when I worked for him as a young captain. So it kind of, and I've been recruiting officers ever since to do the same thing. So it's a self, we always look out for quality folks. I think in Charlie's case, he might have made a mistake, but I'm trying to live up to his expectations. God bless him. And so that's what I did for my research as both a master's student and a Ph.D. doctoral student, was the history of anti-aircraft in the U.S. Army. Hence, you noticed I'm working on what is now going to be a 2-volume study because it's to get really into the details. It takes way too many pages for most publishers to be interested in and most readers to stick with. So the first volume hopefully will cover World War I through December 6th, if you will, 1941 in the U.S. Army. And then the second volume will cover World War II, December 7th, all the way through the end of the war. And it won't just be Army, because you can't talk about something like anti-aircraft artillery without, bringing in the Air Forces, if you will, the Air Corps and the Air Forces in the United States, as well as talking about naval anti-aircraft artillery, Marine defense battalions that developed in World War II to protect island hopping and security of islands, and all of those things. And then who fought and the type of weapons, etc.
Amazing. Once you have it all ready, good to go, you send it to us. We're going to be sharing our pages.
Will
Okay.
do.
All right. So Samuel, do you want to go on to the next question?
So you already mentioned it. How did the First World War impact the evolution of anti-aircraft artillery during the Second World War?
Certainly. Great question. So to
All
repeat
right.
the question Samuel asked, how did World War I, if you will, influence the development in the 20s and 30s and into World War II? Let me offer first something that I spent a lot of time with my students on, which is a systems of systems approach to your military. And every military really depends on a number of external factors and internal factors that create what I call your military system. The U.S. Prior to World War I and even during World War I, very isolated. Most of our military were at post, spread out on the smallest. One of the smallest militaries was spread out on post camps and stations all over the U.S. with a small contingent in the Philippines. And our most recent combat operation was chasing Pancho Villa in Mexico after he did some cross-border raids in the early 1910, 13, 15 timeframe. So um, that idea of isolation clearly played into the U.S. preparation for World War II. Um, Also, economy. So, geographic location, your economic ability, your history and societal memory and culture. Technology certainly plays a large role into the development of and the acceptance of new technology. Not every nation is going to either need to or be able to afford to, let's say, buy the newest weapon or buy the newest jet fighter and keep it up to date. They may not need that. They may just need to be robust from the ground up, for example, in an air defense, and not necessarily have a bomber or a fighter that can do it all. So there's a lot of external factors that go into creating that pressure around the military system. And then internally to the military, and this is usually all services, there's a lot of pressure between the services, inter-service rivalry in some cases, and then within a service, intra service rivalry. Let's say the folks in the U.S. Navy know this, and I'm sure in other navies, there's a big difference between those who fly airplanes off aircraft carriers and those who run the ships. In our Navy, it's the brown shoes who fly the airplanes and the black shoes who drive the ships. And they're two different communities with their two different histories. And then there's also the submarine community as well, for example. And those are three different ethos and three different religions, essentially, within one service, the U.S. Navy. And the same thing happens in the Army, whether it's the infantry is in charge or the artillery is in charge, the Air Corps in terms of, and now the Air Force in terms of its desire to and raison d'etre from World War I on to save the world from having to fight a ground war by using airplanes to win the next conflict. And so all of those things happen internally, both between the services and within a service, particularly as you see a development like anti-aircraft artillery or even airplanes, because there's only a finite amount of money and a finite number of personnel, and you have to divide that pie differently when you have a new and up and coming arm like the airplane or a counter to that like anti-aircraft artillery. And many people don't like it when you start taking away their profession, like the cavalry. I ride horses and pull a saber out for a living. Well, if all of a sudden you're told that's really not effective against machine guns, you've got to find something else to do if you want to be in our army. People fight that to the point where we still had horses in the U.S. Army in 1939 and 1940. Had a cavalry branch that was bent on riding horses into combat in 1939 and did not want to get on with mechanization and motorization because of the old legacy of the U.S. cavalry. So to answer Samuel's question directly, World War I was a watershed event, obviously for a number of reasons in the 20th century. But one of those reasons was the development of the airplane. I argue to a certain degree in my new history that the airplane was the most disruptive technology, certainly of the first half of the 20th century and possibly the entire 20th century. It shattered the issue of distance. It certainly allowed armies and air forces and then navies to prosecute warfare from greater distances. It separated those who suffered at the pointy end of bombs being dropped from those who fought and dropped them. Those sort of differences that heretofore war had been pretty much the spirit of the bayonet, the rifle, the machine gun, the artillery piece, and indirect artillery starts to separate the man from, man on man aspect. Now airplanes take it to an entire different level. It also allowed you to skip over all of that carnage in the trenches in World War I. So it creates an immense threat, an immense opportunity for the conduct of warfare. And it begins to restore offense to warfare after World War I. I like to argue that America invented the airplane, or we were first to fly one successfully in 1903, but then the U.S. Army set it aside and didn't really think about it for the next 14, 15 years until we arrived and decided to enter World War One in April of 1917. Um, During that period, European nations thought much more about the airplane because, again, geographically, they had a proximity to Prussia / Germany that didn't, was beginning to kind of stretch its arms and legs a little bit in terms of power in Europe. Certainly, we saw that in the War of 1870 and 71, the Franco-Prussian War. And there's a whole bunch of French folks who wanted to get back, Alsace and Lorraine, for example, and, also to get back some national pride. So when things kicked off in World War One, you have this rush to war on both sides, and then you have the race to the Channel in latter part of 1914, and a stalemate after that. And that's where the airplane really comes in. Once the maneuver aspect of World War One on the Western Front stopped, and then it becomes, how do you stop the airplane? Whether it's strategic bombing of Zeppelins flying over London and other bombers later on in the war flying over Paris and London, or how do you protect frontline troops from and locations, supply dumps, things like that from bombardment? So that's what develops, the answer to the airplane is another airplane and anti-aircraft artillery. So that's how it starts in World War One. I can go on if you'd like.
I actually, yeah, you can go on, but I would like to add something. We usually open a box of questions to our public, and we didn't get a directly question, but someone pointed out something that actually it's of my interest, and I think it goes according to what you're saying. We have some pictures. I think those are Russian soldiers laying on the ground, like on the grass, pointing their rifles up. And I've seen a couple of these pictures, but there's this one of um, Russian soldiers, and it always comes with the like with the description saying, "Oh, Russian soldiers trying to shut down airplanes." And I would like to, and you can continue talking about it, of course, but like, did it start with people actually firing their rifles and like battalions all together trying to fight to shut the airplanes out of the sky with their like
Certainly.
small arm guns? Yeah.
Small arms, yeah. Well, it goes back all the way to the Civil War, U.S. Civil War, and even before that in Europe with balloons. And what you see is in the U.S. Civil War, the North and the South both used balloons, and the opposing forces hated it. They used them for observation. They didn't go anywhere. They were tethered, but immediately um, soldiers are being told to fire their rifles at the balloon, and artillery pieces are dropping their trail, the part you hook up to the wagon or to the horses, to elevate their tube and attempt to shoot at the balloon to bring it down, or to convince the other side they better pull it down. And so the same thing happens in World War One. If you can get a squad or a company or a battalion to lay down on the ground and point their weapons up, you might actually hit something. The idea being, in an air defense, we call it big sky, little bullet. That it's very hard to hit a moving target in the air with a rifle, but if you throw up enough lead, maybe somebody will run through it. The flip side is it's a small bullet, and so and back then, at least initially, throughout the war, the aircraft they weren't metal. They were fire. They were cloth and very thin balsa and things like that. So unless you hit the pilot or did a lot of damage to the engine, you likely were not going to bring it down. So it may have made you feel good that you could get a company online to shoot at an airplane, but you probably weren't going to do much damage to it. You needed something a little bigger, a lot more rounds as well. So that gets to the idea of using artillery pieces and machine guns against aircraft in World War One. And there's the Germans were more advanced than anybody. Probably next in line were the French. I would say the British, just by virtue of being in the war earlier, and then the Americans. But I think the Americans kind of leapfrogged the British by the time our 18 months or so when the war is over, in terms of capacity, not capacity overall, but ability, given the small number of anti-aircraft pieces that the U.S. Army essentially borrowed and bought from the French. But again, you see crews digging 6 foot hole in the ground and then putting up block and tackling and then maneuvering their artillery piece and tipping the whole thing and lowering the trail into the hole, all while under cover so they don't get either bombed or artillery dropped on them. And then a whole series of science comes into play, trying to figure out how to figure out what the elevation and traverse or angular velocity of the airplane is it's like crossing or coming toward you at what angle, so that you can then aim ahead of the uh, the aircraft, whether it's with an artillery round or with machine gun fire. A lot of mathematics that I don't think any of us today would be able to sit down and scribble out like they did previously. And they would use charts once they had, kind of come up with a good solution. They had firing charts and mechanical directors that would feed this information. And height finders, which were stereoscopic tubes with binoculars on each end, to where you'd have soldiers trying to find the airplane. And once you had two, one end and the other end of the height finder, the soldiers seeing the airplane, they would gather the altitude above the ground and create that angle. And then you had others that were trying to follow it left to right to create the traverse and speed angle. And all this would be fed in, and somebody would yell out, or it would be transferred electronically to the artillery pieces, what to dial in as the elevation and the angle. And then you would have another table to consult for someone to determine what the fuse length ought to be on the artillery piece, so that it would, wouldn't it blow up early? It would stay. It would you blow up when it was near the airplane. So then you'd have to figure out, okay, not only have I figured out the left and right and the altitude, angular velocity of the airplane, but then someone would consult the table and go, okay, I need to cut this fuse for 15 seconds. And so then you'd load the weapon, fire the round, and it would go up, and 15 seconds later blow up, and it'd usually be behind the airplane, not in front of it. The Germans actually improved over a couple of years, and it took them something like 10,000 rounds to hit an airplane, and then they improved to about 5,000 rounds in the last year of the war. The Americans borrowed a lot of not only weapons from the French, because our industry was not prepared for the war, but also borrowed a lot of doctrine. And actually, because of a shortage of French anti-aircraft artillerymen, they would man the French gun on a Monday and a Wednesday, and the French would come in on Tuesday and Thursday, and they would alternate back and forth on the same gun sometimes. The U.S. Army fielded 2 battalions of anti-aircraft artillery pieces using French equipment, and 3, 4, 5, 6 battalions of machine guns as well, with the Hotchkiss machine gun. And that's an interesting story and how they trained as well. So I hope I provided a little bit of insight into or answered your question.
Oh yeah, it's very good. And um, as we go on, like as time goes on after World War One, and this is of course you can observe this, but I have this. I'm amazed by the way the aircrafts evolve from 1918 to 1939. It is incredible that you see those biplanes, triplanes flying, and then you see Spitfires and Messerschmitts like early 1939. Actually, 1937 in the Spanish Civil War, you already have all these aircrafts that will become iconic later. Um, what's the you can talk about the interwar because I think it's important for the answer as well. but how much the development of the aircraft itself impacts the evolution of anti-air defense,
Oh,
right? How does it goes?
yeah, no, great question. You can't have one without the other. And during the 20s and 30s, the airplane was the thing, right? It was the everybody wanted to be a pilot. Airplanes captured the imagination of the American public, the European public, everybody. It was so new. Uh, it also captured industry. So you have, as all of the nations in the 20s and 30s were suffering for various reasons and various degrees of economic and kind of pullback from funding militaries. Particularly the U.S. returned to normalcy. The British kind of put their head in the sand for about 12, 13 years and said, we have a 10-year rule. Nothing's going to change for the next 10 years. And then they got to year 10. They said, yeah, we'll just roll it over and roll it over a couple more years until Hitler comes to power and there's a beginning of movement toward rearmament. The French, for a number of reasons, don't invest a great deal in their military in the 20s and 30s, and they go with a largely reserve-based force, learning some of the wrong lessons out of World War One, that firepower is the way to kill people instead of maneuver. And so the airplane really kind of accelerates and gets a lot of private investment to go along with a modest military investment in many of the militaries. Also, the RAF was founded separately in World War One. In the U.S., the Air Service was actually part of the U.S. Army. It began as part of the Signal Corps, and it remained part of the Signal Corps until about 1925, 1926, where it argued for its separate status, still within the Army. Um, General Billy Mitchell and Hap Arnold, who would become Chief of the Air Forces in World War II, they all argued for a separate service, but the government wasn't willing to go that far yet. A lot of politicians were behind it as well. They thought it was, again, that legacy of I want to keep it, I want to, be in charge of it, not let it, it needs to serve the Army, not serve its own desires. And the doctrine for the Army then became, or excuse me, the Air Force then became, we can save everybody from having to fight World War I again. We can win war from 30,000 feet, 15, 20,000 feet, beginning with the bombing of the former German battleship, the Ostfriesland, in 1921, where Billy Mitchell flew out, and I believe in probably a rigged test. Certainly, it was a clear day. There was no choppy seas. The ships were tethered. They weren't moving, and they weren't shooting back. So they were pretty much easy targets for air service bombers to take out. But all that being said, the airplane was clearly ahead in the air and anti-air, race for supremacy, if you will, in terms of ruling the third dimension, the skies, in the 20s and 30s. Anti-aircraft lagged behind it for a number of reasons. One, it didn't have a civilian industry to pull it along. And so the civilian industry, they're all about improving the speed, the the range of aircraft and the altitude of aircraft, largely for commercial purposes. And then you have the barnstormers who are flying every year, new generation of airplanes out and around the public in county fairs and that sort of thing, and air races that capture the public's attention. So you have development of faster airplanes at the if you will what become fighters, and you also have the development of larger cargo planes that become bombers, and have dual use, and so that technology floats back and forth between the commercial sector and the military sector with some ups and downs. And so by the time you get to the mid 30s, anti-aircraft is trying in many services, and is recognized in many services as important, but the airplane is far ahead in terms of its ability to fly higher than you can shoot, faster than you can traverse, and go farther and farther. And it takes a while for the anti-aircraft establishment in all services to catch up. And I would argue they probably don't catch up, at least in the U.S. Army, until a portion of World War II, into the middle to latter part of World War II.
Yeah, that actually leads us to the next question. I think, Samuel, I think you can go ahead.
What are the key developments within the anti-aircraft artillery during the Second World War? Like, for example, radar or proximity fuses? And how did it impact the effectiveness of anti-aircraft artillery?
No, fantastic question. I'll start with saying every technology in World War One, with exception of the atomic bomb, you see developed and used to a great capacity in World War II. Obviously, the airplane, the tank, the submarine, but you also have the precursor of radar. One of the things I didn't talk about when I was describing World War One was you had people trying to use acoustic sensors to locate airplanes. They were called sound detectors. And for the audience, think of the old style gramophone that played, that produced the sound out of the record. There was a small piece at one end and it opened up into a big horn. Well, think of taking those horns, expanding them in size 3, 4, 5 fold, and putting the small parts in your ears. You found a soldier who had exceptional hearing or better than average hearing, or maybe wasn't deaf, and he stood there with these two tiny ends of the gramophone in his ears and turned, trying to capture the sound of airplanes, and use his body, and it would turn a mechanism that would attempt to point every searchlights in the right direction to find at night, for example, an airplane. And once the searchlights found it and could light it up, then you could use your height finders and your angular velocity tachometers, tachymetric methods to track the airplane and get those figures in the settings for the gun at night. Well, all of that evolves in the 20s and 30s to become, the sound detectors are so obsolete that while they still get used for a period of time, you can't keep up with the airplanes. They're too high. You can't pick up the sound. They move too fast. You can't pick it up left to right. But radar, they're really the precursor of radar. They're passive. And by the way, they're being used today. Passive acoustic sensors are being used today in Ukraine. There's a great picture of one, exactly. That's from the
Yeah,
interwar period.
I just found like many models of it, like many kinds of it. But this one, I think it describes really well what you just said, like a guy with
Exactly.
two big. Uh,
Yeah, they were called war
all right.
tubas. Is
Okay.
one of the nicknames for them. So the war tuba or the sound detector, again, is passive. What you have is even prior to World War I, the use of radio waves to detect ships passing then becomes a way. Electricians and physicists then figure out how to reduce and modulate various frequencies to send out and collect the return signal from something passing by, whether it's a ship on water, a vehicle on land, or an airplane in the air. And that develops to become radar of World War II. There was also some conversation about a death ray, an infrared ray that would go out and do the same around the early 20s. So that's one step of the development of anti-aircraft. You have to find the aircraft, right? You have to locate it,
Mhm.
and you have to be able to figure out what direction it's moving and how fast it's moving, so in multiple dimensions, so that you can then attempt to shoot at it. The other development was a very rudimentary, what they called a director or a computer that took information from a radar and turned it into a firing solution for the gun itself. And these worked primarily with your static guns. When you're static and you're firing large caliber 90 millimeter, 88 millimeter, 75 millimeter guns at aircraft. Um, it took a while to set up the radars. They were large. They weren't tiny like today's radars. They were truck mobile. They were towed. Not many of them were mounted on their own carrier, for example, in World War II. And they were used primarily in the rear. but they would then send a signal, and you still have height finders as well. They would send a signal to this director, which was a mini computer. I say mini; it was about the size of a refrigerator, a large refrigerator, and it had many people operating. And then they would get a solution and send that to the guns, and they would do that, turn the knobs, the dials on the guns, if you will, uh, and that sped the process up dramatically from having to do it manually. And then the proximity fuse, which came out in late 43, early 44, and initially was only allowed to be used over water for fear it would fall into enemy hands, essentially took a small radar and placed it inside a 90 millimeter, which was the U.S. caliber shell. And so that it would fly by, send out signals, and when it got a return, it would explode. It's very much like World War One in that um, there were high explosive shells and then uh, shrapnel shells, if you will. One would attempt to hit the target and then explode, and the other would explode on time. And one, shrapnel was small enough that it didn't necessarily um, penetrate or cause damage to those cloth airplanes in World War One. Um, so in World War One, they used the high explosive because they just wanted the concussive effect. In World War Two, that proximity fuse then explodes and sends this shrapnel through the metal airplane, which is a little different than through cloth. You're hitting something, you're causing problems, you're ricocheting inside the airplane. You've seen Masters of the Air and other movies and shows that show the damage that can be wrought. And you're also firing a lot more rounds per minute because you have the ability to reload quickly. You also have the ability to get to a solution faster. So you could fire 6, 7 rounds, 10 rounds a minute with a 90 millimeter with a proximity fuse and radar. And by the end of World War II, uh, it's pretty clear that the 90 millimeter with the proximity fuse is winning the battle against manned bombers and the V1 at altitudes, let's say above 5 to 8,000 feet, because it could reach out and touch, and it's very, very precise. The flip side is machine guns still matter and rapid fire still matters, and you have this dichotomy, this split between bombing and strafing, if you will, and you've got to take care of these strafing aircraft as well. Those don't necessarily have a radar or a director because the aircraft's moving too fast and it takes too long to set up the radar, and you're supporting a maneuver force that's going across the battlefield, so you don't have time. So it's a lot of what some people call hose piping, or just what we call in the United States Kentucky windage, or using your eye and trying to stay ahead of the aircraft. And that's where having something that shoots a lot of rounds rapidly is important. So in the U.S., you end up with a quad 50, ultimately 450 caliber machine guns on an electric mount that you just have hand controls that slews very rapidly up to 90 degrees, 360. They nicknamed the meat chopper because, again, you're 50 caliber, you're shooting 3,000 rounds or something like that a minute. You could tear off, back then old houses, and you could certainly destroy trucks and airplanes once you came into contact. We also had the 37 millimeter initially and the 40 millimeter Bofors, and then we combined 250 calibers with a intermediate level 37 millimeter gun. And the reason the 37 millimeter 40 millimeter were important, they can reach out a little farther than the 50 caliber. There's a great picture of a quad 50, exactly, a mounted quad
Yeah.
50 on the back of a half track.
All right. Okay. Something you were talking, I was speaking to myself here, that usually when I'm talking to my friends, and none of my friends are into military history or World War II. But when I mention like these kinds of technology they already had, like the 30s, the 40s, like all these computers and electronic things, and electric submarines. They're shocked. It's like, oh, really? I thought it was way more like primitive. Like, no way, man. These guys were. There was a pretty smart people, and they had a lot of technology at their hands. They were working with. All right, so for us to move on, this is an interesting question that I really want to know the answer. Like, could you explain like this strategic deployment of anti-air artillery in major campaigns like the Battle of Britain or Operation Torch?
Sure. Um, Remember, I talked about strategic bombing being the raison d'être, the reason for being for the U.S. Air Force at least, and to a large degree for the British Air Force. The Germans were a little more simpatico with supporting the army, but clearly the Luftwaffe felt it was its own service run by Goering. He did what he wanted to do in many cases, and there's plenty of literature out there about how the German army felt um, left on its own by the Luftwaffe. Um, so we have this dichotomy between strategic bombing and bombers that are flying at high altitudes and low-level aircraft that need to be dealt with a different way, machine guns and rapid-fire cannon. And so you have this in air defense, what we call now HIMAD or high altitude air defense, and SHORAD or short range low altitude air defense. And so you have this dichotomy built up. In Battle of Britain, the British use both, but they're defending static assets that aren't moving, like London, for example, or an airfield. And so they array their short and long range or high to medium and then low altitude anti-aircraft artillery in bands beginning on the coast and further inland on known avenues of attack by the Luftwaffe in an attempt to provide defense in depth and, if you will, defense in depth with multiple heights. They also use barrage balloons, which are one of the things that aren't really discussed nowadays. But again, they were present in World War I in terms of both observation balloons and then balloons that were basically set up to be aerial obstacles to airplanes. Um, when you're bombing from 20 or 30,000 feet or even 10,000 feet, that's one thing in World War II. There's no such thing as precision bombing. Um, the U.S. Air Force has said we do daylight precision bombing, but really it wasn't precision. It wasn't very precise, certainly not by today's standards. And so to really hit the target, you have to drop lower. In some cases, you'd have to drop below 1,000 feet to find your target, particularly if you're in a fighter. And these barrage balloons would be linked together by wires and essentially become aerial obstacles, elevated nets and things like that. Sometimes they had explosives tethered to them. So if a plane came through and caught the cable of the balloon, it would break loose. And over time, the explosive would, because of two different size drag chutes on the cable, the explosive would slide up and blow up supposedly on the wing of the airplane that hit the cable. So you have this layered defense in the Battle of Britain. A difference, and I'm really happy that you asked this question because it highlights the difference between static defense and a mobile defense, like in Operation Torch. In Torch, my research has shown that we mirror imaged what we thought was important going into Operation Torch, the first really overseas campaign by the U.S. Army. There's an example of a barrage balloon. Thank you for putting that up. The U.S. Army favored its strategic, its ports.
Sorry, over London. I had my
Over London,
microphone closed.
exactly.
Sorry. Yeah, carry on. Sorry.
The U.S. Army and its anti-aircraft doctrine initially in World War II mirrored what we thought was the greatest threat. So we did some mirror imaging, which was the bomber. First off, the United States Air Forces, in which it became the United States Air Forces as we entered World War II, all they did was talk about bombing in the late 30s and early 40s. And so obviously the biggest threat concern to the American public and to the anti-aircraft community was we got to stop the bomber. So when we get to Torch, and it's an amphibious operation with a movement to contact to to meet the Germans, to get to Tunisia first before Rommel can retreat and the Germans can reinforce through Tunis. There were 17 anti-aircraft battalions in the rear area and only 4 up front covering the American combat force. So, and that was too few. And too scattered around the desert to be really of effect and have any value. And so the lesson learned is you got to push this stuff forward. Even large caliber 90 or back then 3-inch artillery pieces, you've got to push them forward to provide some high altitude, and you've got to push those shorter range systems forward as well. Operation Torch is a learning experience for the U.S. Army. It's a learning experience for the British Army. But more so for the U.S. Army. The U.S. Army and the Army Air Forces at that time learn a great deal, and they continue to improve the ratio, if you will, of rear area to forward area anti-aircraft improves over the war into Sicily and Italy, and then clearly in the Normandy for a number of reasons. One, there are many more anti-aircraft battalions. The Army Fields initially organizes and stands up 599 anti-aircraft battalions in the U.S. Army by early 1943. It doesn't deploy that many. By that time, kind of it started to crest the wave, if you will, of air warfare and realizes it doesn't need that many. But because of lack of development in the late 30s, the U.S. Army enters the war with not enough anti-aircraft artillery, and then when it gets to Torch, it assigns them to the rear area because it's worried about port defense and airfield defense, and it doesn't realize up front that the front lines that are doing the combat need protection as well. Again, that changes over time as we get more battalions and we learn more lessons and we field more divisions. And by the end of the war, every division in Europe has one or two, at least one, if not two. Every division in contact has one, if not two, anti-aircraft battalions of the quad 50 and 40 millimeter and 37 millimeter with 2 quad 50s. Those mobile, tracked, or towed anti-aircraft, low altitude weapons to protect them, and mostly to protect artillery, because the big killer in World War II for the U.S. Army was artillery. And so every division had a battery of anti-aircraft, and they would put a platoon with each artillery battalion to protect it.
Cool.
So,
Yeah, Samuel. Yeah, go ahead.
could you tell us a little bit more about the different anti-aircraft artillery battalions? Because some of them were equipped with 90 millimeter, some of them were equipped with automatic weapons. And earlier the idea was to combine them, but later they separated the two into 2 different battalions.
Yes, thank you very much. Well, even going back to World War I, there was a gun battalion with, essentially artillery pieces that you dropped into a ditch or a hole, and a machine gun battalion. We get to World War II, and you still have that. You have now in the U.S. Army, you have the 90 millimeter. We graduate from the 3-inch to the 90 millimeter, and then we have, instead of just a Hotchkiss machine gun, you have multiple 50 calibers, either towed or on a half track, with a version of that weapon also on half track with 250 calibers and a 37 millimeter in between. And then you have a towed Bofors 40 millimeter gun as well. A lot of the orchestration of the various battalions had to do with what you could move, what you could transport 100% by itself, being fully mobile. And those were the units that kept up largely with the divisions. And then you had units that were semi-mobile, both low altitude and high altitude 90 millimeters. I have to put a plug in for the 90 millimeter. This is one area where, as Pietro asked earlier, how did the influence of airplanes, the technology, air technology, affect anti-aircraft technology. In the late 30s, the anti-aircraft community realized that the 3-inch gun, which is what they tried to build in World War One, then they shifted to build the 75 millimeter, couldn't produce enough of those fast enough, shifted back to the 3-inch in the 20s and 30s, and then they didn't produce enough of those because of the Depression and other things, that even that gun could not reach an altitude high enough to shoot at and be effective against the new series of bombers that were now flying above 25,000 feet. So they developed the 90 millimeter. It's 2 millimeters bigger than the German 88, which was being fielded about that time. Franklin Roosevelt, President Roosevelt, was a big enthusiast of the 90 millimeter anti-aircraft gun. He liked the 3-inch. In fact, there's a picture of him looking at one on a cover of a Coast Artillery magazine saying, "That's a wonderful gun. I wish we had a bunch more," in about 1936. But in 1940, as he's coaching the American public that we have to be prepared at least for hemispheric defense, if not expeditionary operations, he actually designs a 3 stamp series. He's a big stamp collector. He designs 3 stamps, a 1 cent, 2 cent, and 3 cent stamp, to fund the National Defense Program. And it's all about defense. The stamps all say "for defense," understanding that the American public didn't want to go to war, but they would certainly want to protect their own shores. And the 2 cent stamp is actually a 90 millimeter anti-aircraft gun, and it sold millions between 1940 and mid 42 when they changed the stamp design. Roosevelt drew all 3 designs for each stamp, but he personally, he drew the 90 millimeter because he had just visited a 90 millimeter production facility in Massachusetts a couple days earlier, came back and hand drew a 90 millimeter gun, wrote 90 millimeter next to it so the artist would know, and then approved the final mint, stamp before it went out to the public. So he's a big proponent of defense and anti-aircraft defense in the 1940s. So what you get, to answer Samuel's question, is you get towed 90 millimeter guns because you only have so many trucks. So you tow them maybe a battery at a time or half a battalion, 2 batteries at a time. There's a great picture of a 90 millimeter. And it has those outriggers that hold it down, and you can see the trailer there as well. And it didn't take that long amount of time for the crew to fold that up and hitch it to a truck, and it would drag it. The truck would move it from point A to point B. You had a towed 40 millimeter gun that would do the same thing. I think, Samuel, you're writing on the 452nd Anti-Aircraft Battalion, an African American battalion that had 90 millimeters 40 millimeters, if I'm not mistaken. Yeah. I look forward to reading more about that. And then you had the self-propelled half-track version. You showed a picture earlier, Pietro, of the 50 caliber quad 50s, and those were in platoons. They would have 4 of those and 4 of the hybrid weapon system with the 250 calibers and the 37 millimeter in between. And they would be in they had four platoons of those in a battery. Yeah, there's a great picture of the meat chopper, as we call it.
All right. Okay. Okay, so very good. I didn't know I think I knew this layer of defense, like you need high altitude guns, but you also need lower altitude guns. Never thought about it. Like, what's the catch?
Well,
Okay, so
again,
yeah, go ahead, Tim.
I was just going to say, we can have as many guns of any type as you want, but depending on how many you can produce in your factories, but you also have to move them. And so it becomes a calculus of how many trucks do we have and how often, at what space in the battle, on the battlefield, let's say in Europe, do you have to move them? Once you get ashore and you push inland, you can leave a battalion parked around Cherbourg. You can leave a battalion parked around Le Havre. But you need to have, it doesn't really move that often. So you can leave a couple of trucks for supplying and then for repositioning guns as necessary, but it's not time sensitive. you go closer to the front, midway, you might have to move things around a little more to protect supply dumps as they move or airfields as they get built. And then close to the forward edge of the battlefield where the divisions are fighting, you've got to be fully mobile, 100% mobile, to keep up with the movement of tracked artillery, towed artillery, those sorts of things. So, what purpose the weapon serves really determines how it's designed, how it's certainly its mobility, and then also its range and how many rounds it can put down range, et cetera. And you have to put that all into a calculus as you build your military system. The other thing I didn't mention is, again, they had barrage balloons. You showed the one over London. You see many pictures in World War II of barrage balloons on ships as well. And we had them in North Africa. We had them in Italy. We certainly had them on ships and on the beach in Normandy. In fact, the first African American combat soldier from the U.S. Army were in barrage balloon battalions that landed on D-Day with the 320th Anti-Aircraft Barrage Balloon Battalion. They're also the only battalion that ever deployed. We had a couple of batteries in the Mediterranean, but they're the only battalion that ever deployed. And they deployed twice, actually. They were in Europe, and then they were sent back to Hawaii to prepare to deploy for the invasion of Japan. So a pretty interesting war record for an African-American combat battalion. And as I think both of you know, and maybe some of your listeners know, the U.S. Army did not really want black soldiers in combat units. They weren't deemed at the time as worthy a combat soldier as white soldiers. Obviously, that's untrue, but that was the attitude at the time. And African Americans fought very hard to be in combat units, and those African American combat units that ultimately made it through the war and weren't converted to something else kind of won their spurs or won the respect of the white units they fought with, including an example after the Battle of the Bulge, where Americans had 86,000 casualties and had to replace a lot of infantrymen. Black service support, quartermaster, trucking, logistics soldiers took a reduction in rank to private or private first class and volunteered to be in black platoons inside white companies in Europe. And the result was from the white company commanders and sergeants, they fought very well and said, yeah, we'd take them anytime. And so it really broke down that barrier, but that was very few and far between.
Yeah, go ahead, Sam.
No, I was actually curious. I wanted to touch back on something that you mentioned earlier, like different nations have different priorities, especially during the Second World War. Could you tell us a little bit about like how anti-aircraft artillery was used by, for example, the Germans or by the British?
Sure, certainly. One of the best books on German anti-aircraft artillery is a book called Flak by my good friend Ed Westerman. It came out a number of years ago. I consider it the Bible, the source for German anti-aircraft defenses from 1914 to 1945. Ed's a good friend, so truth in lending, but it's a fantastic book for your readers that want to learn more about it. One of the differences was that anti-aircraft in the German army was controlled by the Luftwaffe, not the army. So you had Luftwaffe battalions that would join the army or join in supporting the army. But at the end of the day, it was Goering and the Luftwaffe that controlled the number of battalions, number of regiments, and type of weapons. The other issue that the Germans faced, that at least America didn't, but Britain did initially, was bombing of factories, bombing of civilian targets, those sorts of things. By the time of Normandy, well over 50% of the German anti-aircraft force, to include airplanes, had been moved back to protect Mother Germany because of the bombing effects, the strategic bombing effects of the British Bomber Command and the American bomber forces in England and now in southern Italy. even Hitler could not ignore the fact that the public wanted some symbol that they were being protected. Uh, and they were doing fairly well um, until about the early to late fall 1944. They were fairly effective in destroying Bomber Command and U.S. Army bombers. Um, but a couple things happened. One, the bombing did have an effect on the movement of spare parts and things. Weather played an effect in the latter part of 1944 as weather got worse. Bombers had to drop a little lower. Uh, and if they could just fly above to see the target, but if they were just area bombing and they were flying above the clouds, the Germans did not. They lost a lot of confidence in their radar. Their radar was not as precise as the Allied radar, and so they were less effective, as Ed notes, in actually shooting down bombers. And the number of bombers shot down by flak, German flak, in the latter part of 44 and then 45 really starts to go down. And it begins to snowball in early 1945. So, yeah, the Germans, and then the Germans had they had 88s forward. There's a famous story of Hans von Lucht, who's a Panzer Grenadier Regiment commander in World War II in Normandy. There's four, I believe, 88 millimeter weapons. Anti-aircraft weapons that are positioned a bit south of Caen in the village. I'm going to pronounce it wrong. Cagny, Cagny, south of Caen, and and the British are attacking, getting around Caen. As you know, your readers, your listeners know that the Germans did a great job stymieing Montgomery getting around Caen after the D-Day landings. Well, they start to come around, and von Lucht goes up to the battery commander and he says, no, these 88 millimeter guns only shoot in the sky. And he pulls his pistol out and he says, I'm taking command of your battery unless you lower your tubes and start shooting at tanks, which he does. So they had 88 millimeters forward. Sometimes the German anti-aircraft guys had to be convinced to lower their tubes and fire in direct fire, but usually not. And they also had 20 millimeter caliber weapons, and I think 37 and maybe 40 millimeter caliber weapons as well in the forward area. Again, those didn't have quite the range, but they could produce more rapid fire. Hope I answered your question, Samuel.
Yeah, no, it's
Yes.
interesting. Yeah, go ahead. Go ahead, Tim.
No, it's also interesting. This is a bit of a digression, because as the war, like Germany is losing the war, and like they're moving in like closer and closer to Germany. So I was actually thinking like they could actually field more guns like in the same area, because they're usually when you're retreating, there's time enough to evacuate so they can retreat
Yeah.
their static guns. So I had actually expected them to, yeah, not to like have less. How do you say it? That there would be less casualties among the bombers because of the decreased effectiveness.
Yeah. No, that's a great point because obviously, when you're retreating, you're collapsing on your own country, your own supply lines, those sorts of things. A number of things come into play. You would also think that would make the Luftwaffe more effective. But the trouble was, and it plays a little bit into the ground air defense as well. Um, Bomber Command and U.S. strategic bombing had really destroyed the French and large portions of the German transportation system in a prelude to the Normandy invasion, and then after that, it also hit fuel supplies dramatically, which doesn't allow. There were some places where German anti-aircraft units had to request permission to move, and it sometimes was denied because there wasn't enough fuel. The other piece of it was if you have airplanes, and the Germans kept producing airplanes, but the quality of pilots was dramatically lower because they'd killed the Allied air forces had killed a number, and anti-aircraft forces had shot down a number of airplanes. And so the quality of the pilots were lower. They also didn't have as much aviation gas to prepare. and practice. So you had German pilots going into combat with maybe the ability to take off and land and not much else. And then that same thing applies a little bit to anti-aircraft artillery as well. And moreover, there were just a lot of units destroyed or left behind as German units retreated from France. Pictures of the collapse of the pocket south of Caen, for example, the Falaise Argentan gap and the closing of that pocket at Mount Ormel by the 1st Polish Armored Division. Nothing but upside down tanks and dead horses and artillery pieces and everything else. One thing I'd like to point out, interesting, I don't want to take too much time to do it, but looking at my numbers here, there we go. In Europe, from 6 June 1944 to 8 May 1945, U.S. Army anti-aircraft artillery destroyed 2,138 German planes, likely destroyed another 1,000, and damaged. The record for damaged planes is incomplete. So roughly 3,151 airplanes destroyed or likely destroyed by ground fire, anti-aircraft fire. Throughout the entire war for the U.S., and my numbers are a little incomplete. I've got to do a little more research. I think they're actually higher than what I'm about to quote. And these come largely from that one anti-aircraft study done by Alvin Sabula and produced as Army Ground Forces Study number 26 in 1946. Total throughout World War II, 4,036 planes destroyed by U.S. Army anti-aircraft gunners, another 1,482 probably destroyed, and at least 366 damaged, for a total of 5,854 German airplanes affected significantly, destroyed or significantly damaged during the war. That does not include 2,300 V-1s that were destroyed in the defense by U.S. gunners in the defense of Britain, the defense of Paris, Liège, or primarily Antwerp. As you know, as your listeners may know, Hitler decided that the V weapons were revenge weapons. They weren't going to be used at ports in southern England. They weren't going to be used on the Normandy beaches. They were only used once in a tactical attempt, and that was to shut down crossing of the bridge at Remagen, the Ludendorff Bridge, and they landed in the water and were a failure. They didn't hit the bridge. But the U.S. Air Forces claimed 15,800 aerial victories in World War II. I can total almost 6,000 airplanes shot down or significantly damaged by U.S. Army gunners from the ground. You add those two together, and you've got about 22,000 airplanes destroyed. I'm sure there's some overlap, but the best we can do in a rough order of magnitude. So anti-aircraft gunners destroyed over 25% of the enemy German, Italian, Japanese flying things in World War II. And when you add the V-1s to it, it increases dramatically. So I'd like to leave your listeners with that understanding, and hopefully that's a plug to read the books as they come out, to learn more about a force that killed over 25% of the German, Japanese, and Italian air forces, but you never heard about it. You'd be hard-pressed to find a book that covers this. You'll see pieces of it in the Army Green books and other histories, but you'll never find a history of this completely, and certainly not to the depth and breadth for which I hope to cover it in the near future.
Yeah,
I
it's
think
it's
that's
interesting because go ahead, Sam.
no, and it's interesting that you touch on this because it's so anti-aircraft artillery is like saying waiting for days, maybe weeks, like for the enemy, and then like when they arrive and it's a strafing attack or it's a bombing attack, it's like seconds or minutes, and then it's over.
Mm-hmm.
especially at the end of the war, like the capabilities of the Germans to like perform strategic bombing were like severely diminished. Um, sure, the fighters still existed, but they were again largely limited to like attacks near the front and not in depth to the rear. So yeah, that's. I just want to comment on what you said.
No, exactly. It's often lonely on a cold, frozen hilltop somewhere. You know, if you're a squad leader in one of those weapons, and having done it professionally, yeah, it's miserable out there. But you're not an infantryman either. You're not living and dying in your foxhole either. So it's all credit to those on the front lines. A lot of anti-aircraft guns also fought in direct fire mode. For example, during the Battle of the Bulge, when the Germans broke through, there was some 90 millimeters in direct fire that stopped the Germans from penetrating certain road crossings behind Bastogne, in the vicinity of Bastogne and Saint Vith and other places. So there's a lot of fighting up front. They used them in the Pacific, even as the Japanese Air Force started to dwindle and protect the home islands more, and revert to kamikazes. The 90 millimeter has such a fast trajectory that it's almost flat. You point it at something, aim over open sights, and you can hit what you're aiming at. So when infantrymen would try to clear caves in Japan and fight through to get to these caves, it was ferocious. Sometimes they would just call on the anti-aircraft our guys to hit it with a bunch of 50 caliber fire, or what they called sniping with the 90 millimeter gun, shoot around directly into the front of a cave from 2,000, 3,000 yards away, and it was deadly. It was you know just phenomenal for what it could do, and it also both systems were used as indirect fire. More and more, you would see the 90 millimeter because of its high trajectory, um, and the speed of the round. It would go up and come down before you would even hear the boom from the round would land before you'd hear the boom from the tube. So the Germans were particularly afraid of it, and a lot of artillery was the big winner. Anti-aircraft contributed to that in a lot of counter battery fire because it had a longer range than some artillery systems, and it was much more rapid fire in some cases, although it didn't move as rapidly as self-propelled artillery. So it fought in multiple dimensions as well.
But near the end of the war, they put the 90 millimeter anti-aircraft gun on a tank to fix the issue.
Yes, yes, yeah, and now we have 105 and 120 millimeter smoothbore on the M1 Abrams mod A whatever. I don't remember what model we're up to now, but yeah, um, the caliber matters, and the propulsive, the effect of the powder matters, and what the warhead contains matters, and so, like I said before, between radar, the proximity fuse, and the belts of 90 millimeter around Antwerp. In the spring of 1945, made Antwerp almost impenetrable to the V1s that Hitler was launching at them. Now, the V2, the precursor of the Scud, was an entirely different story because while we could track it with radar, we had nothing that could reach that altitude, nor could you get it descended, at such great speed from almost exo-atmospheric heights that you couldn't adjust fire rapidly enough with the gun or predict rapidly with the 90 millimeter to hit it. It would only be luck. So the V2s did a lot of damage, and were the silent killers. The V1 you could hear, you could tip it with an airplane, and you could
Bus.
certainly find it with a 90 millimeter radar and a proximity fuse.
Yeah, you answered. I was going to ask you this, but you just answered my question. Because I often listen to people say that the V rockets in general were, well, wonder weapons, but like almost impossible to defend against. But it seems that the V1 was not that. Um, amazing as the V2 was. But anyways, you mentioned like all these different kinds of anti-air defense and mobility and different calibers and different guns in different places for different tasks. How's the how does logistics happen um, for anti-air defense? How does that goes?
That's a great question. One of the problems that Ukraine is facing, and I spoke with some Ukrainian Air Force officers about 3 weeks ago, um, is that they have a collection or a hodgepodge or a kludge of anti-aircraft air defense weapons, everything from Patriot and NASAMS to which are missiles and Stinger, and down to the Gepard, which shoots I think a 30 millimeter round or 35 millimeter round. And so you have two problems with this, and it's the same problem that existed forever. Um, is that you have to get an air picture, you have to know where the targets are, and you have to communicate that to the gun rapidly, and you have to distribute your fires so you don't have everybody firing at the same target. And you want to attack the targets that are most likely to attack your asset, the asset you're defending, and you have the highest probability of killing. Um, and for if the U.S. had 90 millimeter, 40 millimeter, some 37, and 50 caliber, well, we produced enough ammunition and enough 50 caliber ammunition that it wasn't an issue. Produced a lot of 37 caliber, 37 millimeter ammunition, a heck of a lot of 40 millimeter because it was used on Navy ships and it was used in the Army as well, and some allies used it in the 90 millimeter. Um, but for the U.S. Army, it's distribution of that ammo um, and distribution of other supplies, fuel, other petroleum products like grease and lubricants, spare parts as well. What in the Army we call Class 9, but spare parts, repair parts as well. Um, it works really well when you're in a static location. When you're moving, when you're supporting, and as we were expanding from Normandy, for example, or in Torch, where we're expanding at a rapid pace, you've got to move your logistics forward. You've got to move depots forward. You've got to move supply dumps and collection points forward, and repair points to repair vehicles and firing systems forward. So you would attach, let's say in the forward area, a self-propelled um, automatic weapons battalion, which would have those quad 50s you showed and other half-tracked weapons. And they might get some of their supplies from the local units they're supporting. The artillery would use the same gasoline or diesel as the anti-aircraft units, for example. They might have some of the same vehicle repair parts, engine repair parts, and that sort of thing. And they had, all these battalions had their own mechanics. Their batteries had their own mechanics. But the ammunition, and of course, food is food, but the ammunition would be a different thing, and it would have to be provided largely by the anti-aircraft battalion that was supporting that division. So just like today, you would send supply trucks to the collection or the ammunition point, get that ammunition and move it forward. And it obviously behooved the division supply officer to help you in any way possible. So you'd have packages of ammunition moving forward. Trucks that might have artillery rounds, anti-aircraft rounds, rifle rounds, grenades, mines, all sorts of things packed on it, moving forward. So it wouldn't just be one type of munition. So that you could, and you would pace that. Logisticians learn to pace what the demand is by what type of operations and the enemy they're facing. So they would, configure that load, combat configured ammunition loads appropriately. And we still do that today.
Nice. Yeah. Okay. So can we like we are talking about anti-air defense, but we didn't cover exactly what these guns are defending. So where do you place them, and why do you place them in places like, I don't know, factories, ports?
Sure.
I don't know.
Well, ports are an easy one. Airfields, from an air perspective, air power is critically important, both from a bomber perspective and a fighter perspective, if you will, or interdiction perspective. And the air doctrine forever has been, don't shoot down one airplane, go and attack the nest and kill all the eggs, right? Well, the nest is the airfield. And so you wanted to protect that airfield, not only with fighter protection potentially, but also anti-aircraft protection, high altitude, potentially barrage balloons, some low altitude, and you needed to integrate that with the air forces so that, if a friendly airplane came back, you weren't going to shoot at it. And so there were on and off times, if you will, when aircraft would be launching or being recovered, that the Area Air Defense Commander, the AADC, a term from back then and that we still use today, would control the fires. Usually it was an Air Force or Air Forces person. They would control the fires over that static asset, the airfield, because they would have a better idea of where their airplanes were and where the enemy airplanes were. The Air Forces had a much longer range because they were more static, much longer range radar as well, but they would feed that information to the anti-aircraft, and often they would locate their headquarters side by side. So you would have a sector operations center right next to, which would control the airflow and have an air picture right next to an anti-aircraft operations center. So they would share that information. The information would go from the sector operations center to the anti-aircraft gun room, they would call it, gun operating room, which would then control the fire of the guns. And so you would tell Alpha Battery that's facing in one direction to shoot at track 1132, and Delta Battery facing in an opposite direction to shoot at track 4761, so that you're organizing your fires, and you'd also tell them when not to fire when friendly aircraft were coming in. So there's one level of inter-service, if you will, integration to prevent fratricide. Another thing, because aircraft recognition was a skill and still is a skill, recognizing a certain airplane in the sky, obviously with binoculars. It was very bad early in the war. And this is a vestige of World War I, where everybody shot at airplanes. It was a vestige of our 1940 Louisiana maneuver war games, where troops would stop and just stare at the airplane and not do anything, and had to be disciplined and taught that it's either friendly or it's enemy, and you better react accordingly. If it's enemy, you might die. And if it's friendly, if you shoot at it, it might die and we'll be really upset. So that's where part of this control came in, was to ensure that you'd only fire at an aircraft determined hostile, for example. And to make that more effective, in fact, at one point, fratricide was so bad from the guys on the ground against airplanes, or airplanes against artillery units and tanks on the ground in North Africa, that one division commander said, "I want you to fire at every airplane that flies over," because he didn't trust the U.S. Air Forces or the British Air Forces not to kill his own men. So he said, fire at everything. And then finally that had to be adjudicated, and you pull those soldiers off from that commandment, and you get better orchestration of the air battle and returning airplanes, so that you don't kill your own people from the air and you don't kill your own pilots from the ground. When we get to the invasion of Normandy, you see those black and white stripes on airplanes, the invasion stripes. It's another way to signal to gunners on the ground and other airplanes that are providing fighter protection not to shoot those airplanes. So it's a visual link as well. And you had restricted areas over airfields and over ports. Over ports, it might be a different commander who would issue that, but you'd still probably have a sector operations center who would command the air picture and tell people when to fire, when not to fire. Over forward area, it was much more a lower altitude fight, and control of the air picture was usually given to the forward area units, the division, the battalion commander, that sort of thing. And it relied more on visual aircraft recognition than anything else. So hope I answered your question.
Extremely interesting, actually. I was going to ask you, like, how can you not shot your own people out of the sky? Because yeah, you answered that. That's cool.
Well, there's a
Thank you.
very famous incident, sadly, the invasion of Sicily, I think on the second night. In fact, interestingly, it happened to both the Americans and the British. The Americans first, and I think the British on the third night of the invasion. We were going to have what essentially was an administrative airborne drop, I think on the second night of the invasion, the 11th of July, 1943. And airborne commanders, Matt Ridgway, for example, was not too keen on this, but they were told to go ahead and do it. And he tried to get the word out to all the Army air defenders that were already on ground on Sicily not to fire at aircraft during this period of time. What we believe happened, historians at the time and now believe happened, was that the word didn't get to all the Navy ships with their own air defense anti-aircraft. And all it takes in those situations, when the Luftwaffe had flown over an hour earlier and bombed one of the the off-beach loading locations, ports of debarkation, an hour earlier, all the gunners in the area are skittish and nervous. And all it took was one gunner on one ship to fire it at a C-47 transport. And next thing you know, everything from every ship and some on land opened up. And we lost a number of C-47s, a number of paratroopers killed or scattered all over the battlefield. And again, ironically, the same thing happened the next night to the British, who were trying to land airborne troops to take the Primsall Bridge in Montgomery's sector on the east side of the island. So yeah, and as a result, Eisenhower has an investigation. He's irate at Patton, at Montgomery, that these things are happening. One of the things, the corrective factors, was more training for the guys on the ground, the ship's gunners, as well as those invasion stripes I talked about, so that you would hopefully know what your airplane looked like.
Yeah, crazy. Yeah. People don't. I think people tend to not realize how confusing can a battle can be. Like, you don't really know what's going on in a larger scale. So if you're in a ship and you're watching the sky and you're nervous already, you're probably gonna protect yourself,
Right. You
and this
might
kind of things
protect
can happen.
yourself.
Yeah.
There's also a lesser known but somewhat infamous um, Battle of Los Angeles that happens in 1942. Um, there's actually no battle. The Japanese had run some submarines up and down the west coast of the U.S. and had shelled some places, to include some places in Oregon, and I think it was a refinery or something near Los Angeles. Uh, and so people are on edge. We have a civil defense capability in terms of coast watchers and air watchers, and there's a number of anti-aircraft battalions in the Los Angeles area. Well, the night after one of these Japanese shellings that didn't really no damage, um, an anti-aircraft unit says, "Hey, I'd like to, can we get the air forces to fly an airplane out so that we can track it with our radars?" Well, the Air Force was too busy or ignored them or whatever. So the guy says, "Well, you know what? Let's just use one of these weather balloons that we have to check the weather, because meteorological data is important when you're doing your calculations for a round that's going to go up to 30,000 feet. So let's just float this balloon up and we'll track it with our radar." Well, they did. That was fine. But unfortunately, it kept going in the prevailing winds, and other units tracked it and then started shooting at it. And once one unit shoots, other units report and shoot. And then another unit tried to do the same thing, except they tied a flare to the balloon, the meteorological balloon, as it went up. So then they see this light. So then other units are firing. And then as it drifts inland, they're not only firing over the water, but they're firing rounds inland at ghost targets. And so a lot of damage was done by falling shrapnel in the Los Angeles area. The next day, there was no damage from aircraft, and soon they realized, oh, that's a goof up on us. But the famous Battle of Los Angeles against those fake targets, or what you thought was the enemy.
Awesome. Yeah, Samuel, go ahead with I think it's the last question. It's the last
Mm.
thing. Yeah.
So we talked a lot about the past and about disruptive technology. Now there's of course another technology emerging, artificial intelligence. It also has its own associated supply line, so to say, like chip manufacturing. Um, could you briefly share your thoughts on this topic and how it might impact, yeah, the army of the future, so to say?
Certainly. Um, you bring up a great point about the supply line for chips. I guess you can have the code, but if you don't have the chips, the very, very high speed, chips or whatever, then, that's great, but you can't use it or you can't put it in your weapons. Um, First off, let's talk briefly about technology in general. Not every technology is suited for every military, for example, because militaries have, in various countries, in various locations, for various reasons, have different missions, different types of missions, different needs. So new technology as it pertains to the conduct of war is something that it's more like a door you have to step through, having made the decision to take that step based on whatever your nation or your military thinks it needs going forward. That said, your comment about the chips in the supply chain reminds me of, um, you know, the rush for atomic weapons in the great Oppenheimer movie of World War II. You had to have uranium, and you had to be able to, upgrade it, and then you had to be able to put the whole thing together. So you might have theory about how to do it, and it reminds me of all those raids on the heavy water factories in Norway and the great stories that go into those operations. By depriving the Germans, trying to deprive the Germans of heavy water, for example, that was one thought. Well, okay, they might have the science, but they don't have the material. Um, and so it's just an interesting conundrum. Humankind has never refused a weapon. The only one that we have outlawed is gas and bio, and I think the concerns about those are such that they will remain that way for a while. Um, who knows if engineering will get at some point where we have bio warriors, hybrid humans or something. Um, but all the way back to the invention of the first handheld equivalent of a rifle, the arquebus, when the Pope tried to ban it, people didn't want to ban it. And the atomic weapon, the atomic bomb, it's been used twice, and we've had treaties to keep it from being used again and to lower the security dilemma between nations that have atomic weapons, nuclear weapons. I hope it's never used again, but but they do exist. AI is going to be another one of those technologies that will clearly affect our lives as humans on the planet, and also will clearly affect warfare. The U.S. military is trying to embrace AI, and as a teacher, we're trying to embrace AI with our students as well, because you can't outlaw it. Like the arquebus, you're not going to be able to outlaw it. People will use it, whether they say they're using it or not, whether they use it for an essay to improve their writing, or whether they use it to help program a weapon to be more autonomous. And so it exists and it's going to be exploited. Um, that brings on this whole discussion about for what, to whom, and what rules apply, and do militaries decide to apply different rules based on who they are, where they are, what they see their purpose. Some nations may adopt autonomous weapons. Others may not because of the moral impact of wanting to have a human either in the loop or on the loop, as we say. Some may adopt the Air Force. Our Air Forces are thinking about loyal wingmen, I think is the term they use, where you'd have autonomous aircraft partnered with a manned aircraft. And the question then becomes one of command and control, one of logic and planning for the autonomy. What level of autonomy do you give that weapon? Is it still directed, or can it be autonomous, or is it even directive to the manned pilot or the manned weapon? The other piece is I'm sure all militaries are exploring the use of AI to help them do work faster, to crunch numbers, to crunch science, to figure out and assist with everything from load planning and moving of logistics to finding targets in various, you know, degrees of foliage and camouflage and desert and other things. So it's going to be used. I guess the big question is to what extent, and to what extent do you allow autonomy and autonomous systems? And we're seeing a lot of that right now, I believe, in Ukraine. Um, we're seeing unmanned systems clearly, the birth of drone warfare, which is bringing air defense back into style, if you will. I have this saying that nobody checks their windshield wipers until it rains, which I think is pretty true. Well, you tend not to check the quality of your air defense until you need it. You tend to ignore your windshield wipers when it's sunny, only to find that they're dry rotted and falling apart in the first big rainstorm. And you tend to ignore your air defense until you really need it. And we found that the U.S. Army's found it. I was talking to a Dane the other day. The Danish Army got rid of most of their air defense and Air Force in the early 2000s, and all of us are having to rebuild that after having lost a almost 2 decades worth of experience in everything except shooting down missiles with Patriot batteries. So we've had to rebuild that, and we're still in the process of rebuilding it. That's why this work that I'm working on from anti-aircraft in World War I in the 20s and 30s, and then in World War II, I think is important because, as I mentioned earlier, the airplane is one of the, if not the most disruptive technology of the 20th century, certainly the first half of the 20th century, and how nations and their militaries dealt with that technology, not just on the battlefield, but how they marshaled all the things we talked about: training, doctrine, supplies, materiel, how they organized on the battlefield, how they resupplied and adapted once combat started to deal with the airplane as it continued to progress from World War I biplanes to metal-sided, multi-engine, high-altitude bombers and fast-moving fighters. How the anti-aircraft communities in various militaries developed across that, what we call DOT-MIL PF, doctrine, organization, training, materiel, leader development, personnel, facilities. How you bring that whole suite of capabilities together to produce combat capable units and then deploy them is something we have to answer again in this age of drone warfare. And what is old is new. As I mentioned, Ukrainians are using sound locators, acoustic locators, as a passive measure to find drones in an aircraft in Ukraine. And they're using a collection of systems to battle against missiles and drones as well. But the proliferation of drones is creating a need for a proliferation of something affordable to shoot them down. And all militaries are dealing with that right now.
Yeah, while you were talking about like the technologies from the past are useful nowadays, I remembered a video I saw of some, I don't know if they were Russian or Ukrainian, but they covered an entire road with nets, which is something you would compare with the barrage balloons and the chains and everything. You're still protecting using basically the same ideas,
Right.
right? That are still effective. Effective.
Yeah.
Samuel, yeah, go ahead. Go
No,
ahead.
to say, yeah, you're
Jump
talking
in.
about passive defense,
Mhm.
camouflage, being hidden, moving at night, revetting your positions. So if you are attacked, you can withstand an explosion, those sorts of things. And then active defense, shooting at something, or either in the air with another drone or with something on the ground, for example. So yeah, it's a little bit of the same technology. It doesn't change. Using decoys, all that. It's going to be labor intensive in many cases. It's going to be material intensive. In terms of drones, the Ukrainian folks I talked to said they put up 1,000 drones a day, and that's a lot of hardware, a lot of software, but they've learned how to do it, and I hope they keep learning how to do it. Over to you.
Yeah,
But also
me too.
the payoff. I mean, say 1 in 100 drones hits a vehicle or manage to disable it. Like, of course, like you lose the drone, maybe you lose 100 drones, but that's a lot less than when the other side cannot use a tank.
Exactly, and
Yeah,
that's the point. You don't want to spend $1 million missile against a $50,000 target, which you don't want. Unfortunately, you can buy a Shaheen drone for that, right? Which is a much bigger drone. Um, you know, you don't want to. So you have to find the affordability aspect of it. Again, I mentioned budgets, geography, history, culture, all those things play into it. We have to come up with technologies that are effective against drones, both reconnaissance and target acquisition drones, and then killer drones, kamikaze drones, um, because if you can be seen, as always, you can be hit, and so you've got to take the eyes away from the enemy, and then eventually take their new manned bombers and attackers, which are much smaller, away. But you don't want to do it with a Stinger missile. That's a waste. You've got to find something that's affordable, and that you can produce, and the rounds are cheap. And so that's a battle, or a technological battle, that everybody's working on right now. And maybe it's not a round. Maybe it's a laser
Jammer.
jammer.
Yeah.
Maybe it's EW, or electronic warfare. Maybe it's a sound, sonic thing. It could be a combination of things, and that's where technology and trial and error come to play. And like anything, warfare is, unfortunately, everything gets advanced during a war. Technology, supply, medicine, all of that stuff gets advanced because you're testing it against an enemy that's reactive on a daily basis.
Yeah. It's a big opportunity to, unfortunately, again, but it's a big opportunity to put things into practice. You can create many theories, but when it comes down to combat and war, you're going to be testing in reality and how effective the ideas actually are. You know the ways you know the way you have to go when you properly test something in a real situation, right? You're going to be
Exactly.
adapting. Okay, Samuel, do you have any final considerations?
no,
No. Dr. Greenwald, would you like to say anything else? We're coming to the end of the episode, so any final words?
Well, first, I really appreciate the opportunity to spend time with you, and Samuel, and your listeners today. And I'm happy to come back, and I look forward to the book coming out, and talking more about the topic. My hat's off to those who are out fighting wars today, in the air, using some of the next generation of techniques that I've been talking about. We've been talking about from World War I to World War II. As long as there are things flying in the air, there will be a need for someone to shoot them down. And we keep this,
Yeah.
we got to stop this roller coaster of preparedness or readiness. And I think we now realize that with drones and missiles. They're the cheap man's Air Force, and everybody can get a hold of them now. And so I really appreciate your time. I would encourage everyone to pay attention to your podcast. It's
Well,
fantastic. I'm
thank
going to
you.
dial in from time to time now, and I'm sure I'll learn a lot from your other guests. And I'd like to encourage everyone, as the new vice president for the Society for Military History, the largest uh, international society, English-speaking society for military history, to log on to our website at www.ssmh.org smh-hq.org, and find out more about the society. It's very welcoming. It's open to everybody from enthusiasts, if you will, to lay readers, folks who just enjoy, like Pietro said early on. He really gets into World War II and all topics World War II. Those folks don't have to be a scholar, don't have to be a Ph.D., don't have to be studying in a college or university. It's a wide breadth of folks that are interested in military history. And you don't have to be someone who's into battles. You can be into how militaries and societies affect each other as well, or the racial impacts of a war on certain populations, like in the Holocaust or elsewhere. We have subject matter from A to Z, and we have members from 1 through a million. We encourage you to check us out. We've got a conference in Mobile, Alabama, if you happen to be in the United States and you're interested, or you want to fly on over, coming up at the end of the month on the 27th. And there's a one in D.C., Washington, D.C., next year in 2026 at the end of March. But again, enough of that. I'm just thrilled to be a part of a military history podcast, and I want to thank you, Pietro and Samuel, for your time. Thank you.
All right. First of all, we we are the ones who should thank you because you. I always tell my guests that I think time is the most important asset in life, and when you guys, our guests, you dedicate your time to us and our audience, it's an honor, and we appreciate it a lot. Especially when we talk to people like you, uh, because you don't only, it's not only about your expertise, of course, that's what we were looking for, but also the way you put it out, the way you communicate it. It was a very, 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 very nice time. I enjoyed like every second of it. I didn't, sometimes I'm talking here and I'm looking at my phone, dealing with other stuff. I wasn't distracted at all by anything. It's just listening to to your um, to your speech and your knowledge, learning from it. And I'm pretty sure our audience will love it. I also encourage people to get in touch with the Society for Military History. I already opened the website here. I'm going to put the link in the description of this episode, and I'm going to be sharing this on my Instagram, the World War II daily. It will be there for people to see, to check it out. I'll probably make a bunch of stories about it so we can promote it together and work together to this better understanding of history and how things actually happened back in the day. I think it's important for the world to learn from the past. Okay, with all, I think I mentioned and I said everything here. Um, so again, thank you very much, Dr. Bryon. We appreciate your time and your knowledge. Uh, to the people who are listening to this episode until the end, it's been 2 hours, right? So if you got to this point of the episode, don't forget to follow us on Instagram. The links will be also be in the description of the episode. There you're gonna have very good and diverse content about World War II. Um, don't forget again to subscribe to our YouTube channel and follow us on the other platforms such as the Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Amazon, and Deezer. Please do not forget that every last Friday of the month we release a new episode, as always. And thank you very much, people. I'll see you on the next one. Hello there. Thank you very much for watching until the end. If you liked the video, please leave it a like. If you didn't like, unlike it and tell us in the comments how we can improve. Don't forget to subscribe because that supports us a lot. And stay tuned for more here in the World War II Daily Podcast. Thank you very much. I'll see you on the next one.